Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Art with Suzanne. It's wonderful to see so many people here, all our usual regulars. Now, I know you'll be wondering, where is Barbara today? Unfortunately, Barbara's just had an emergency, and she, at the last minute, literally 2 minutes ago, and I have now the unfortunate pleasure of stepping in for her. So I'm sorry, I will do my best to be Barbara, but I am not Barbara. Anyway, today we've got a wonderful selection of paintings with you. We have a special guest in the name of Andrew Colski, who will be taking us through a selection of some of the paintings that hang in London's finest gallery between Southeast and North London, where we are. Andrew actually lives in the Southeast, and many of you will recall he previously did a presentation for us, and he's back again by popular demand. And so without further ado, I shall now pass you over to Andrew. You please, will you bear with me, because as I say, I normally do the technical side behind here. We have Barbara at the front. So there may be a bit of mumbling and fumbling around here, but I'll do my best to try and keep this show running as smoothly as possible. Andrew, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you, Fiona, and hello, everybody.
It's wonderful to see you. You have a selection of paintings
Yeah,
that you are going to take us through. I shall just get them up if you can just bear with me. Right. Tell us about why have you decided to take us from southeast London to northwest London? Give us a bit of background.
there are thousands, if not millions, of views of London in art in various forms. So it's very hard to narrow that down to half an hour. So I've taken a journey from where I am in Bromley in southeast London up to not quite where you and many of the audience are in Kensal Rise in northwest London. I've called it a short journey in space and time because, as we'll see shortly, I've arranged the pictures today in sort of a geographical order along that line from south to north. It meanders a bit, but they do follow a route. The consequence of that is we'll be jumping backwards and forwards in time as we move from picture to picture, but hopefully there'll be an interesting perspective on the history of London and on the history of art.
Okay, I know you're saying this, you're taking, I mean, we'll be covering a vast distance over this next half an hour. If we were going to walk this journey, I mean, how long do you think it would take us?
Well, I think that the next slide might reveal all because it's Google Maps and it says it would take us at Google Maps pace 6 hours 50 minutes to walk the 20 miles from Upper Norwood to Kilburn via this slightly meandering route through London,
Okay,
starting off near Crystal Palace Park, heading up through Battersea, along the Thames through Westminster and the City, and then heading northwest from there.
a very long journey. Okay, so we're starting off at 47 to 49 Fox Hill, and here is our first painting. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Fiona. So we begin in southeast London, or what is now southeast London. Then it was the rural Surrey countryside. Fox Hill, Upper Norwood in 1870, painted by the leading French Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro, now in London's National Gallery. Um, Obviously, the Impressionists were known for painting sort of the suburbs of Paris, not London. But the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and the chaos in Paris that followed meant that Pissarro and many others fled to London for a bit of peace and quiet throughout the winter of 1870-71. Indeed, the French Emperor Napoleon III himself fled to London and ended up living in Chislehurst, which, like part of this scene, is today in the London Borough of Bromley.
It's a very atmospheric painting,
Yeah.
and you know, in terms of the colors used. Can you tell us a bit more about that and the construct of it?
Well, I mean, it is a typical sort of scene of everyday life that you get in the Impressionist painters. A view of Pissarro settled in near the Crystal Palace, which was at the top of the hill. You can see in this picture, which was then sort of a big centre of the arts in London at the time, having moved out from Hyde Park after the Great Exhibition. So Pissarro stayed. That's why Pissarro was staying in southeast, what is now southeast London, and painting scenes around the area.
Mm.
Um, Fox Hill is still there today. It's rather more built up with later Victorian terraces, but you can still see it on Google Street View, snaking up the hill with that little bend in the road to right and left halfway up. Um, and you know, it's an ancient lane. It's one of those that's an ancient parish boundary. And even today, the left-hand side is the London Borough of Croydon, and the right-hand side is now the London Borough of Bromley, formerly the district of Penge. So you'll get different dustbins on each side of the road. Um, you know, as I say, I get a thrill going into the National Gallery and seeing famous, internationally known artists painting my bit of southeast London. Also in the National Gallery, there's the Avenue Sydenham, which is possibly a better known painting. I picked this one because it fitted in with the winter theme we had in Suzanne's first talk of this season. And you can also see Lordship Lane Station at the Courtauld Institute when it's open.
Okay, so something to see when we finally get back to normality.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So your next painting, what can you tell us about this?
So this is, we've moved a bit from southeast to southwest up to Clapham Junction, which, as those of you who know South London will know, is not in Clapham, it's in Battersea. And we've also moved forward about 100 years to 1978. And this is by the British artist Carol Waite. It's in the Tate collection, but since Carol Waite died in about 1997, he's gone a bit out of fashion and it's not on display anymore. What I like about his pictures is that he doesn't just paint a scene, a place, and quite a lot of his works are of suburban scenes as well. But he's always telling a story. There's something going on. There's a mood. There's an atmosphere, and you can see that here in the dark clouds, the purple colours, the jagged zigzags of the composition, which reflects the genuine topography of the place. And Carol Waite's studio was in this area. He walked past the station all the time. He would travel from it up to London. You know, as I said, there's always something going on. And what you can see in this scene is that, you know, the figures to the sort of right-hand side are sort of moving quite quickly. They're running because they've got those sort of lines behind them. It's cartoon style to show their rapid movement. The figure at the bottom right is sort of awkwardly fitted into the corner as he's rushing out of the scene. And as you look into the background a bit more, you can see the figures on the left are the ones in uniform. The one at the far left is blowing a whistle and pointing. So there's clearly something going on. Are they chasing these fare dodgers, or is there something more nefarious going on? And you know, this area has been a bit gentrified in recent years, but in the 1970s, it was pretty rough and run down, as you can see from the fact that the station building is all boarded up. And at the time, it was due to be demolished, but fortunately, they never got round to it. And you can still see almost exactly the same scene today, except the station has been cleaned up and repaired, and those boarded up windows and are now all opened up and are now an entrance to the station. And you can also see in the background on the white stone tower with the copper roof on the right-hand side of the Arding and Hobbs department store, quite a sort of local landmark of the area. Arding and Hobbs got taken over as part of the Alders chain, which went bust in 2008, and latterly has been a branch of Debenhams, so it might face an uncertain future these days. And behind that, you can see the shops and houses snaking up Lavender Hill in the background.
Yeah, because you mentioned in the practice run that this area here was actually Lavender Hill.
That's Lavender Hill.
And what strikes me about this whole painting is actually the lavender color, the purple, that is infused in this picture. But I think there's and the disproportionateness of the building vis-a-vis Lavender Hill. Was that deliberate, do you think, or is that just the way it is?
Well, I think as I say, he's trying to sort of create some drama in the way that he is sort of putting in all these strong features into the landscape. But it is quite a steep hill at that point. So I think now I've got a quote here. It says, Carol Waite said, "I pass this almost every day on my way to the studio, and I've always been fascinated by the switchback aspect of the composition, which suggests violent movement. The rather eerie architecture supports this feeling."
No, it does. It does. And as you say, the movement with the sharp lines here, having that sort of comic style to it. Okay, we'll move on to your next painting.
Yeah, and so we moved slightly further north, still in Battersea, but now on the banks of the Thames, looking across the river towards Chelsea. And we've also gone back 100 years, back to the 1870s. And this is a painting by Whistler, the American artist who settled and worked in London. He settled in Chelsea. So that contemporary with the French Impressionists, similar but slightly different style. And this is his painting Nocturne, Blue and Gold, which is a view of Old Battersea Bridge. This is in Tate Britain. This is, as it says, the old bridge. So the bridge was replaced shortly after by the current structure. But the very tall pier of the bridge, sort of right in the center of the picture, is slightly exaggerated for effect and inspired by the design of Japanese woodcuts that were fashionable at the time, still are. And what you can see is, in fact, there's fireworks in the sky on the right behind the bridge, and then on the far shore, the twinkling twilight lights of the Chelsea side of the river. And on the left-hand side, you can see sort of protruding from the bank is the tower of Chelsea Old Church, which is still there today. So that's a landmark that you can still see as you look across the river from south to north. And Whistler is well known for having engaged in a rather acrimonious legal dispute with the famous critic John Ruskin, who accused another of Whistler's nocturnes, which is not on display in London but is in America, of flinging a pot of paint in the face of the public. Whistler didn't like the criticism and sued Ruskin for libel. There was a very prominent court case at the time. This picture was one of those used in evidence in the trial, apparently. The court found in favour of Whistler, but wasn't very impressed with either side, only awarded one farthing in damages, awarded both sides to pay their own costs, and effectively ruined them both. So I think the answer is don't take art criticism to court.
And also, I mean, one farthing in damages, and if one dare to think what the value of this painting would be today. Now, I was curious to know, what is this an image of? Oops, bear with me a second. We're having that. Is this an image of a person here?
That's a person on a boat on the river, probably
right.
Someone sailing on the river, crossing from one side to the other.
Yeah, and I suppose what struck me about this painting is it is extremely well. It's simple quote, simple, but it isn't. There seems to be. It's very striking, and I'm not quite. How do you think you would have achieved that impact?
Oh, that's a technical question. That's a bit beyond me. But what I have got is a quote from what Whistler said at the trial, which was, "I did not intend to paint a portrait of the bridge, but only a painting of a moonlight scene. My whole scheme was only to bring about a certain harmony of colour." So that's why he called them nocturnes. He was interested in evoking the mood, the colour, and the light, rather than a realistic depiction.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay. And your next painting?
This is the same scene and indeed the same era, and indeed in the same room of Tate Britain. You can see these pictures together. This is another view of Battersea Reach, this time by Walter Greaves, not so well known. And as you can see, in a very different style. We are much more back to the realistic style. Also, this is looking the other direction from the North Bank back to the south. Now, Walter Greaves was the son of a Chelsea boat builder. You can see the boatyards in the foreground here. And his father had been Turner's boatman when Turner was painting river scenes, because Turner, like Whistler, lived in Chelsea. But Greaves was the boatman who took Whistler out to paint his scenes on the river, and they became friends. And indeed, Walter Greaves became Whistler's studio assistant and pupil, and became a painter in his own right. And Greaves's view on this was a quote from him: "Chelsea was so beautiful that you couldn't but paint it. To Mr. Whistler, a boat was always a tone. To me, it was just a boat." And what you can see in this scene is in the foreground, one of the famous Thames barges with its sails furled up as they're unloading or loading up the goods. There's another Thames barge in the middle of the river there, and we saw some of those in Barbara's last talk about transport with the sails there. In the background, to the left of the boat, you can see the tower of Battersea Old Church, which is still there. To the left, the warehouses and chimneys of the factories that used to line the south bank of the river there, like the Morgan Crucible Chemical Factory, which are no longer there. And then moving to the right, you can see the bridge across the river, carrying the steam train, which you can just see behind the sails there. That bridge was relatively new at the time. That carries trains from Clapham Junction across to Chelsea. And those of you in Kensal Rise or elsewhere along the North London line may well have used that bridge, because it still carries trains on that line from Kensal Rise and elsewhere to Clapham Junction today. And to the right, the green fields of Chelsea, which are now covered by the Lotts Road Power Station. And if I were to appear on camera, you can see the scene today.
Wow. Next time I take this trip, now that you've told us about this, I do go on the overground quite a lot. I would definitely look out for this scene, and I'm sure it won't be as it is in this picture, but I can always imagine.
The one thing that is still there is the church tower, but it's now over towered by modern tower blocks.
Right.
But there were still boats on the Chelsea side at that point, as if you could see me, you could see.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. And I like the phrase that a boat for Mr. Turner, a boat was a tone. I think this you can see it in the colors here. very subtle, quite rich in themselves. Okay, your next painting, Andrew.
Yeah, well, we now moved further into central London now and further back in time. We're now in the heart of Westminster. And this is a painting by the famous Venetian painter Canaletto, who in the 1740s and 50s spent a decade working in London when European wars meant that his main customers, the British tourists, stopped coming to Venice. So he came to them in London to continue being able to sell his pictures. And this is a view of St James's Park looking towards Horse Guards Parade. On the left, you've got the lake in St James's Park, which is still there. What is there is quite a broad path with all the people walking along it. Is now the road that runs between Horse Guards and the park. To the right, you've got a red brick building right on the right-hand edge, and just at the edge of that, a white stone building. And both of those buildings you can still see today from the park. Those are the back end of Downing Street. That's where Downing Street ends up. Apparently he painted this picture on spec in order to sell it to some of the residents of Downing Street who might want a picture of their own home by the famous Canaletto. In the centre of the picture, in the background, you can see the old Horse Guards building to the right a bit. There, yes, that's the old Horse Guard, right a bit, there with the tower on it. That's the Horse Guards building as it was in 1749. But it was only very shortly after Canaletto painted this view was it replaced with the stone building that you can see today. And Canaletto was still there in London to paint another version of this view with the new Horse Guards that is still there to this day. That's on loan to the tape from a private collection, so they won't let me show it. But when you can get back to the tape, you may be able to see it there.
Wow, fascinating. I think, as you say, I mean, this picture speaks for itself. The dimensions, the structure, the construction, the colors, and yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Your next painting, Andrew,
please. So I've already mentioned Turner, the most famous British artist, perhaps, and that he lived down the river in Chelsea. We're still in Westminster. This is the famous and calamitous burning of the Houses of Parliament in 1834, and this is a watercolor also in tape written by Turner, who, like all the people you can see crowded into the front of this scene, rushed along to Westminster to see this fire and to paint it. And he painted quite a few versions of the scene of this fire. And this is sort of the palace yard where you can stand today, again, now a busy road. And so on the right-hand side, you can't see the palace. You can just see this huge mass of fire and smoke illuminating the light sky, with the jets of water feebly trying to contain it. But you can see in the centre, just above the cursor there, you can see the triangular sort of pediment of the medieval Westminster Hall, which was the one bit of the palace complex that they managed to save and is still there to this day with its wonderful medieval wooden roof. If ever you get a chance to get inside it, it is in theory being Parliament open to the public if you can get through the security. That's the place where you go to meet your MP.
Yeah.
And on the left-hand side of the road, you can see it's sort of illuminated by the flames, but separated from them, fortunately, the backside of Westminster Abbey. So you can see the tower of the Abbey and the Henry VII chapel at the western end of the Abbey there. And that still looks very much like that today, but obviously the palace itself has been replaced by the familiar structure that replaced it in the 1850s.
Wow. We saw that you showed this to us earlier at the rehearsal, and I think the heat of this, I mean, it is just coming off, and I suppose it's all the really reddish mixture of colors that is used here. It's quite something. And you did mention something about the way he picked out, the people, the way they were painted here, the ones here. Is there anything more you can say about that?
Well, only that you can see a crowd of people.
Yeah. Okay. No, fine. We'll leave it there. Okay. Your next painting, Andrew.
Yeah. So this is the Palace of Westminster that we all recognise, even in silhouette. And now moving forward again in time, and also to the other side of it, further down the river, moving further east. And this is Claude Monet, another French impressionist, friend and colleague of Pissarro, who we saw earlier. And Monet, like Pissarro, did come to London during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. But Monet liked London, and he came back many other times, and he stayed regularly at the Savoy Hotel for several years around 1899 to when this was painted in 1904. And the Savoy Hotel has finally realised that they could latch onto this, and you can now stay in the Monet suite if you can afford it at the Savoy Hotel, which is one of the rooms he stayed in. He didn't actually stay in the same room every time, but he always liked a room high up on the 5th or 6th floor so that he could just look out of his window and paint. So this is the view from his hotel room looking one way towards the Palace of Westminster. He painted various versions of that view, but he also painted various versions of the scene to the other way, which would be Waterloo Bridge and Charing Cross. But this is a particularly nice picture. I couldn't find one of his London scenes in a London gallery, so I've broken my rule here. And this one is actually in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, which I thought was probably the next best thing to London. So one day you may be able to go and see it there. Monet often came in the autumn and winter because he liked also, as we saw with Whistler, to look at effects of light and colour rather than paint a realistic scene. And it's known from his famous views of Rouen Cathedral, which painted the same scene over and over at different times of day, different light conditions, different seasons. And so this is early morning through the fog. You like to come in the autumn and winter to see the famous London fog and the light effects that cause. So you've got the rising sun shining through the fog and reflected off the river to create these wonderful, swirling, colourful effects.
Yeah, I think I don't think there's anything more to say. I think this picture really speaks for itself, and I think we can forgive you that even though it is not hanging in the London galleries from Musée d'Orsay, we get the opportunity to see this fabulous painting.
Yes, I mean there is also many other Monets in the National Gallery in London, including one of his 1870 versions of this view, but I particularly like this one.
Yeah, I think of all the paintings you've shown us so far, this is one of my one of my favorites actually. Okay, your next painting.
Yes, so we've moved further east along the Thames, and this time we've actually moved further in space than in time, because this is only 2 years later, 1906, The Pool of London by André Derain, another French visitor to London, and this one is also in the Tate. But André Derain was a much younger generation of artists. He was part of the group known as the Fauve, which is sort of French for wild beasts. I mean, like Impressionism itself, it was a derogatory nickname coined by a critic, but which stuck. The leading sort of painter in that group was probably Henri Matisse, the modern painter, friend and rival of Picasso. Derain part of that same circle. And the Fauvist period, which is very much the sort of first decade of the 20th century, was very much about using big, bold blocks of colour, again, not trying to be realistic, but to evoke a mood. And this view is from London Bridge, looking down through the Pool of London, which was the main port of London, towards Tower Bridge. And you can see the busy cargo boats in the foreground, the wharves and docks all along both sides of the river. And Tower Bridge, another familiar silhouette there in the background, only about 10 years old at this time. Tower Bridge created in the 1890s to relieve the traffic of London, but it's the famous lifting bridge is to enable all the goods traffic, the port traffic, to come into the Pool of London here. Only 2 years after the Monet, but in a very different style. And indeed, Derain was told or recommended by his dealer Vollard to go to London to paint some scenes of the river, because Monet's paintings have been so successful and were selling well. So Vollard said to Derain, why don't you go to London and paint some scenes too? And this one is still in London, somewhere in the Tate, although I suspect, like the Carol Waite, possibly not on display at the moment.
Actually, the style, it reminds me of a painting that Suzanne showed us in the early days of the Art with Suzanne talks. And if my memory serves me correctly, it was a Suzanne painting, and the thing that she she picked out was the stab, 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 jab, jab, jab of the painting. So you get this, as you said yourself, the lines, the blocks of color. Compared to the Monet one, which we've just seen, which is more sort of enmeshed, smoothly spread. This is a different technique.
Indeed.
Interesting, but beautiful painting. Okay, your next one, please.
Yeah, so we're moving from the river into the heart of the city of London, and indeed this is called Amongst the Nerves of the World by Christopher Nevinson, a British artist who sort of became well known as a First World War artist. But also painted scenes of London in later years. As I say, this is 1930. He was part of the Vorticist movement, which was very modern and sort of influenced by Cubism in the years before the First World War, which had this very sort of jagged, triangular, breaking up the image type of approach to painting. But what you can see here with these triangular lines is they are actually telegraph wires linking the buildings on either side of the street. The street is Fleet Street, and this is when the newspaper industry in Fleet Street was very much the heart of the world. You can see things like Daily and News written on the front of these newspaper offices along here. And this is looking along Fleet Street, very busy and bustling with all the buses and the taxis and all the people bustling around. Looking up Ludgate Hill towards St Paul's in the distance with the towers of the city churches.
Sorry, Andrew.
Getting ahead of ourselves there. And so I mean, the street scene has changed a bit. The building on the right with the triangular pediment at the top, you can still that's no, not the right a bit. That one, yeah, that triangular pediment, that building you can still make out in street view. Other buildings were replaced later in the 1930s with the newspapers being so successful. And I think this view is taken from around the point of the wonderful Art Deco Daily Express building, which was built just a few years after this. And also what you can see here, as in the picture of the river at Battersea, is a steam train going across the bridge in the centre. That bridge going across Ludgate Hill, right across the front of St Paul's Cathedral, was finally removed in 1995, I think, in the 1990s. And that railway now runs underground as the Thameslink line, and that is the location of City Thameslink Station, if ever you've been on that route, which gives an uninterrupted view to St Paul's up Ludgate Hill these days.
It's a very busy. You do get the sense of the busyness, don't you? Just by the sort of the shapes and images used. Yeah. And you know what? I'm going to say something really bizarre, but I think I can see the makings of the cucumber building here. You know, the sort of the shapes.
Oh yes, the gherkin, I think.
Yeah, sorry, the gherkin, not the cucumber. The gherkin building.
Yeah.
In this area.
Which is very much just that bit beyond St Paul's from this view.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, the London skyline has been constantly evolving and changing in the city. And this picture is actually in the city, in the Museum of London. It's one I've always liked. It's one I had on my wall when I was a teenager.
Right. Okay, so something that's very special to you.
Yeah.
Okay, your next painting, Andrew, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so now we finally moved to Mornington Crescent. Hooray! So we've moved a bit further out into northwest London now, heading north out of the centre. And this is a painting by Spencer Gore, who was part of the Camden Town group of painters. As an organised group, it was quite short-lived, although their influence was more wide. They only were founded in 1911 and bound themselves up by 1913. But sort of the leading artist in that group, Walter Richard Sickert, is probably the best well-known of the group. But his Camden Town pictures tended to be more of dark and mysterious interiors with strange goings on. But obviously I wanted to show views of London, so I turned to Spencer Gore, who was the first president of that group. Although they both lived in Mornington Crescent. And this is the view from Spencer Gore's house at 31 Mornington Crescent, which is now commemorated with a blue plaque, if you want to go and find it. And this is the view across the gardens of Mornington Crescent, and you can see right in the centre the very distinctive and familiar colour and shape of the glazed red tiles of so many underground stations in London. Those on the Bakerloo, Piccadilly, and what is now the Northern Line, were all built in the first decade of the 20th century. And you can even make out the words on it, Mornington Crescent Station. And below that, below the first floor window, you can actually make out the words Hampstead, because that line was originally known as the Hampstead line before it became the Northern Line. So that tube station is still there, and you can still see that. Through the leafless tree to the left of it, you can see the imposing facade of the Camden Palace Theatre with its dome on top. And that is still there today, although unfortunately the dome was damaged by fire only in 2020, as recently as that. So that building is now being restored. And on the left-hand edge of the picture, you can see the pub on the corner of Mornington Crescent, and that's still there as well. And that parade of houses, that terrace of houses along that side is still there. The church spire you can see in the background above the station, that has gone. I don't know exactly where and when. But the major change in this area, if you know it at all, is that there are no longer any gardens in Mornington Crescent. And that whole space for the whole of the Crescent is now occupied by the huge mass of the Black Cat cigarette factory. It now has a different name, but it was built as a cigarette factory in the 1920s. And the facade facing the station is built in Egyptian style, which was very fashionable in the 1920s after Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered. So although all the buildings around Mornington Crescent are still there, the Crescent itself has undergone some changes since then. This particular picture is in the British Council collection, so it could be in any British Council building in any embassy around the world. There is a very similar view that Spencer Gore painted, which is in the Museum of London, but he painted it later in the year when the tree in the centre had come into leaf, so you couldn't see the view quite so well in the other picture.
Thank you.
This one.
Thank you for that, Andrew. It's such a difference. I don't know. You feel the difference from when you're going from the south, and now we are, as you say, in the north. There seems to be such a distinct difference in the style of paintings and the images.
Well, I mean, what I'll say about this is, now this is 1911, so this is actually 5 years after the Duran we just saw. But we've actually, but it's more recent. But we've gone backwards in style. I mean, the Camden Town Group very much influenced by post-impressionist people like Suzanne you mentioned, Van Gogh and Gauguin. So British art was sort of 20 years behind French art in terms of how advanced it was at this period.
Okay, beautiful painting. Okay, your next painting, Andrew, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so we've moved forward quite a lot in time and in style. This is 1991, but we've moved very, very short space or distance because we are still in Mornington Crescent. This is by Frank Auerbach's view of Mornington Crescent. What you can see on the left-hand side is the crescent of houses, the Victorian terrace, and about halfway along is Spencer Gore's house. So from about there is the view we've just seen, looking from left to right. But what you can see on the right is no longer gardens, it is the backside of the Black Cat cigarette factory, with the factory chimney sort of jutting upwards towards the top of the painting, and the on the right hand side, the sort of the squares are the window frames of this concrete framed building. Now, Frank Auerbach, still alive, or I think in his 90s now, was born in Berlin in 1931, so yes, it'd be 90 this year. But he came to Britain in 1939 as a Kindertransport refugee. The rest of his family didn't make it. He settled in London, and in his adulthood, he became part of what's known as the School of London. Well-known painters like Lucian Freud, but also Leon Kossoff, who we're about to see. And they became known for their sort of views of London as well. And Auerbach, like the Camden Town Group, like Monet and Pissarro, painted the areas that he knew and that was around him. His studio is still there somewhere in the Camden Town area. I don't think they reveal exactly where it is. And also, like Monet, like Turner and Whistler, he's painting different effects of light, different times of day. I like this one because of this is called early morning. So again, you've got the rising sun, the pink and orange sky, similar to Monet and the orange of the Turner again. And Auerbach said, I haven't painted Mornington Crescent to ally myself with some Camden Town group, but simply because I feel London is this raw thing, this extraordinary, marvelously unpainted city, where whenever somebody tries to get something going, they stop halfway through, and next to it, something incongruous occurs. This higgledy-piggledy mess of a city. And this picture encapsulates that with the incongruity of the Victorian terrace on one side and the 1920s factory jutted up against it on the other side of the road.
Yeah, it certainly does. And it almost feels like it's quite an angry painting, with the reds and all that, to convey that sense of the higgly-piggliness of London. As it's evolved.
Yeah.
Oh,
now,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say I haven't given a location for this painting because I think it's probably in a private collection. I think someone has bought it. Lucky them. But it did appear in the Tate in their Frank Auerbach exhibition a few years ago, which is where I was lucky enough to see it.
Wonderful. Okay, your next painting, Andrew.
Next and last, because we're now well into northwest London in Kilburn, which was as close as I could get to Kensal Rise, I'm afraid. But some of you may know Kilburn Underground Station. This is 1987, so we're still in the School of London. This is Leon Kossoff, born in London, but to Russian Jewish immigrant parents, part of the same circle as Auerbach. Kossoff and Auerbach both studied under David Bomberg at Borough Polytechnic in 1950s. London, Borough Polytechnic being takes us back south of the river. Bomberg was part of that same sort of Vorticist group as Nevinson, who we saw earlier. So this is very much the next generation. And Kossoff also has lived and worked in London his entire life. He died a few years ago, but lived in Willesden from 1966. So this was just a 10-minute walk from his house. He painted this view many times. And Kossoff said, "London, like the paint I use, seems to be in my bloodstream. It's always moving, the skies, the streets, the buildings. The people who walk past me when I draw have become part of my life." And what you see here is the people, but also he mentioned drawing. He tended to do charcoal sketches on site and then paint these pictures in the studio. I mean, he shares the style with Auerbach. It's very sort of freely painted, very thickly painted, almost three-dimensional when you actually stand in front of the picture. This one is in the Tate when they choose to display it. But whereas Auerbach's street scenes are sort of empty, this one's full of people, and there's people in the foreground, and you can also see people in the booking hall. In the background, there's people going up right in the centre, up the stairs to the platforms, which, if any of you have used Kilburn Station, I haven't myself, will recognise that view. And Kossoff said that when painting public scenes, portraits of people close to him begin to appear in the crowds. And this group of people in the foreground has been identified by one of the Tate curators as comprising Kossoff's wife, Peggy, his brothers, and his longtime model and friend, Fidelma. I'm not sure who is which, but you know, these aren't just the crowd. These are people from his life who appear in his pictures.
Wonderful. And as you can see, as you say, I can see the similarities between this one and the Auerbach one that we've just seen. And I'm sitting here trying to make out which I have used Kilburn Station, and trying to make out which bit it is. But I think that's a fascinating painting.
Yeah. Well, next time you go there, you'll have this in your memory, and
I certainly will. I won't look at Kilburn Station in the same way.
You might start recognizing faces in the crowd.
Exactly. Well, they probably look like this now. Yeah. But Andrew, thank you so much. I mean, that has been a wonderful canter through paintings between the south of London and bring us back to the home ground of the north. It's been brilliant. We'll have a point of we'll come to question time. But out of interest, of the selection you've shown us, which is your most favorite?
Oh, that's a very, very difficult question. The Auerbach is the one I have on my wall. I was very pleased to find the Carol Waite because I haven't seen that picture for so long. Like I said, he's out of fashion, but I've always liked his pictures. He used to be a feature of London before he died. You quite often go to the Tate or the Royal Academy to visit an exhibition. You say, "Oh, look, there's Carol Waite." You'd see him in the galleries. So I like that one. Because I like the mood and atmosphere in his pictures. Mm-hmm. I always like the Canaletto because Horse Guards is somewhere I go or used to go over lunchtime when I was working in Westminster. And like I said, I've always liked the Nevinson. I've picked them all because I like them all.
Yeah, and we can see why. We can see why. But thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expert wisdom, and your paintings with us. I am now going to open the floor up to questions. For many of you who are familiar with the format, it's a matter of just unmute your phone and ask away. Thank you.
I'd just like to say, Andrew, thank you so much because it was really interesting. And thank you for introducing me to Nevinson. I thought that painting was amazing. Yeah. I've not heard of him before.
No, he's not the best well known, but as I said, it's the painting I've always liked since I first saw it in the Museum of London.
Thank you. Any more for a question? Richard, you normally come up with a very interesting question. You're on mute.
No, I'm not mute now. Yeah, you put me on the spot like Barbara does.
Yes.
No, more than anything, just to say how interesting it was to see so many parts of London and so many different styles. And like the previous person who spoke, I hadn't come across Christopher Nevinson before, and I really like the style of that. And I completely saw what you said about the Gherkin building as well.
Yeah, yeah.
By chance, it looks like that. Yeah.
It does, doesn't it?
So really lovely. Thank you. And thank you for stepping in at such short notice. You must have been really thrown.
It was a real panic. It literally was a minute before we were to go live. So it was, but let's hope that Barbara is fine and okay. So I'm not going to prolong your time. Thank you for indulging us with your time. We'll be back on the 28th of March with Out with Suzanne. This time Suzanne will be in the seat, having been to Hollywood and back, wherever she's signing big deals, having successfully appeared on Out with Suzanne. So, and the theme will be quite timely. It will be spring. So make sure you're there. It will probably change the time to 5 o'clock, so as to fit in with people's schedules. But once again, thank you so much to Andrew Colski, and thank you to you all for joining us on this show. Thank you so much.